Hello, my name is Jason Habig. I'm the debate coach at Hathaway Brown School in Shaker Heights, and I'm also the district chair for the Cleveland area for the National Speech and Debate Association. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about the format that we'll be using for the Thurgood Marshall oratorical debates. So at some point later, you'll be talking about the topic and more detail that you'll be debating, but in any debate, you have a statement, a resolution, that is what will be debated by the two teams. That's agreed upon ahead of time so that you have time to do research. And then during the debate, there'll be an affirmative team and a negative team. The affirmative team is the team that agrees with the statement, and the negative team is the team that disagrees with the statement. The statement that we'll be debating is about the public funding for renovations to Quicken Loans Arena. So in this debate, the affirmative would come up and say they think that public funding is good and necessary and in the benefit of the people of the Cleveland area. And then the negative would argue that the public tax money going to that Quicken Loans Arena renovation would be bad. A couple of things to note before we talk about the format. You will be debating both affirmative and negative at the tournaments you will compete against. So your team will need to prepare to debate both sides over the course of a day's worth of debate. When you're coming into a specific round of competition, you will be assigned to be either the affirmative or the negative team, and then you'll carry out those parts. The way we've set up this format is a team is made up of 3 speakers, and before the debate begins, your teammates and your coach will decide who the 3 speakers in this debate will be. You can see that the first thing that takes place during the debate is the affirmative first speaker gives what's called a constructive speech. A constructive speech means that this is where the team will construct, introduce, lay out all of their arguments. This speech is a maximum of 5 minutes, so it can be shorter, but you want to fill as much of the time as you can, and after 5 minutes, the judge would cut you off. And this is a speech that is completely prepared ahead of time. So when you're working, getting ready for the debate tournaments with your team at your school, with your coach, one of the big jobs will be putting together this first speech, thinking about what are our best arguments, in this case, why public money for Quicken Loans Arena is a good thing, and laying out what those arguments are in a clear way, backed up by research, all things that you'll be talking about over the course of your trainings. That speech will last up to 5 minutes, and then when the affirmative first speaker sits down, the negative team will have its first speaker stand up, and he or she will lay out their constructive speech. Same purpose, laying out and introducing all of the main arguments, providing research to back all of those things up. Again, 5 minutes being the maximum. A normal format that people use for these speeches is they start with some sort of introduction that gets people's attention, maybe a quote, maybe an anecdote or a story. Then they would lay out possibly 3, maybe 4 of their best arguments. And sometimes debaters use the word contention, so they would say contention 1, here's our first argument, contention 2, contention 3. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and you should do what sounds most natural to your team and your coach. When those first 2 constructive speeches have concluded, there would be 3 minutes of cross-examination by the first speaker of both teams. So speaker 1 and for both teams would stand up and do cross-examination of each other. What that means is that the affirmative first speaker would ask a question of the negative first speaker. The negative first speaker would need to answer it. Then the negative first speaker would ask a question of the affirmative first speaker, and you would go back and forth for 3 minutes. Again, 3 minutes is a maximum. You don't need to fill all 3 minutes of the time, but you're going to want to ask as many questions as possible because that's going to maybe expose weaknesses in the arguments made by the other team, possibly help you lay out like what arguments you'll be making later in the debate. After that, those first 2 speeches and the cross-examination takes place. We move on to the second part of the debate, which is done by the second speaker on each team. Notice that the last 4 speeches in the debate, so speaker 2 and speaker 3 on both teams, Before they speak, there is 3 minutes of preparation time. This is time that the judge will count off, and you would have time to just work with your team on what will be said in the next speech. So you get 3 minutes before each of the speeches in the middle and end of the debate to prepare with your team. You can sit at the table, you can talk to each other, you can organize your information, you can search for a quote or a specific bit of information you want to use in response. That preparation time is really important. You don't have to use all of it, but I highly think you would want to. But when you're ready to get up at the end of that 3 minutes or sometime in the middle of that 3 minutes, affirmative speaker number 2 would stand up and give what's called a rebuttal speech. A rebuttal speech is a maximum of 3 minutes. After 3 minutes, the judge will say time and cut you off. And the idea is that this speech is extemporaneous. You have no idea what arguments the other team will make before you go into the room, especially for your first tournament. You can predict what kinds of things they're likely to say, but you don't have a copy of their speech ahead of time. You need to be ready to respond to the points they're likely to bring up, or to think on your feet and make responses on the fly. As a result, this rebuttal speech is not pre-written. The constructive speech by speaker 1 is pre-written, but this rebuttal speech is not. And that means you're going to need to organize your facts in a way that you would go through and respond to the points brought up by the other team. A typical extemporaneous rebuttal speech sounds a lot like the following. My opponents brought up the argument that, but here's why our argument is better than that, or why that argument is invalid. And then you might give the specifics, bring up a piece of information. Maybe you're reading new information. Maybe you're just explaining again the information that was previously laid out in your constructive speech. But this speech is it's a challenging speech because you're not just reading, but this is where the actual argument in the debate takes place. When the affirmative speaker number 2 has finished his or her rebuttal speech, the negative would then give a rebuttal speech. There'd be, again, 3 minutes of preparation time counted off. Then the negative speaker would get up, give a 3-minute extemporaneous speech, doing all of the same things that we just talked about for the affirmative team, just from the opposite side. At the end of the negative speaker 2 giving a rebuttal speech, speaker 2 from both teams would come up and again do 3 minutes of cross-examination. So 3 minutes in total where the affirmative and negative speaker ask and answer questions of each other. Probably at this point you're really trying to highlight what you think are your best arguments and expose weaknesses presented by the other team. But you have up to 3 minutes to do that with this time. We then move into the final stage of the debate, where you have an affirmative speaker 3 stand up and give a speech that we in debate usually call a final focus. This is the last time that you'll get to speak to the judge and try to convince him or her that your argument is the right argument and that the judge should vote for your team. You probably will be pointing out arguments that you've made that the other team never responded to. You'll probably be synthesizing and using your best persuasive speaking to convince the audience that your way is the right way to vote. There's lots of possible ways to do that. Again, this speech probably is not pre-written because you don't know how the other team is going to respond to your points, but there might be parts of it that you use from speech to speech where you say, here's why we believe passionately that the Quicken Loans Arena public funding is a really good idea. Okay, so this speech is sort of summary in focus, part responding to what the other team has said, but it kind of brings it all together and is your last chance to talk to the judge. And then after an additional 3 minutes of preparation time, the negative speaker 3 would give up and give his or her final focus. Again, this speech is extemporaneous. It's the last chance for the negative to speak. And then at that point, the debate would be concluded. Each debate takes approximately 40 minutes. If you keep the time strict, it would be 40 minutes. There might be a little bit additional time, especially at the beginning when people are a little unsure of themselves and don't know exactly how this is going to go. And when the debate is over, usually what happens is the two teams shake hands, and then they leave the room, and the judge fills out the ballot and makes a final decision. I hope that explanation makes sense. At some point, you'll get a copy of this on paper so that your coaches and you can have it as a reference point. And I'm excited to hear about all the great things that go on as part of the Thurgood Marshall Oratorical Debate Competition this year.